Richard. So welcome everybody. Just to sort of position where we are. Module 1 was around the digital landscape. So looking, as you can see in the box on the right, at who is online and how they're giving particularly. And we tried to take, as I mentioned yesterday, quite initial, because we're still waiting on some data, but quite an initial dive into what the current COVID situation meant for those things. Module 2, which we looked at yesterday, was around getting ready to run your campaign. So we looked at, having looked at the external world, we took a look at what's going on internally. And I think one of the big takeaways from me, I don't know if everyone else in the room, was about actually, you know, this is not a case of creating something, putting it on a website, stepping back, and it'll just magically go viral. A lot of people, I think, when we were commenting in the comments box, were talking about actually, you know, how important it was to make sure that the, you know, the internal structure and the messaging and the people that you're working with, etc., are, you know, all in place really. Specifically as well, we talked a little briefly about, you know, getting the right platform, getting the right software in place to facilitate this, and then really crucially, you have to find your crowd. So ideally before the campaign starts, you'll have a decent sort of size crowd in place, both to fundraise from and to potentially sort of amplify your message. And that really is a sort of key principle that will run right the way through your campaign. You need to sort of carry on marketing, for want of a better term, carry on sort of building that crowd and spreading that message. But today, where we're going to really focus is around the case for support and really sort of getting the messaging right. And you'll either be pleased or upset to know that actually you're going to get not that much input from me in comparison to the other two sessions. A lot of today is really going to be about you all sort of communicating, talking to each other, looking at examples, and really trying to pull out from your point of view what you think some of the sort of key success factors are in terms of messaging. And then module 4, where we'll finish off next week, we look at making the most of the campaign once you've got it. So we'll look at things like assessing the results. Can you build in any sort of testing into, you know, any element of your campaign? And really importantly, once you've built your crowd, how do you go about building those ongoing relationships and those people potentially becoming longer term supporters for your archive? I've already said that, you know, if anyone joined just in the last couple of minutes, please do pop a quick introduction to who you are and where you're from into the chat box. That would be marvellous. But whilst you're doing that, as I said, we're going to, you know, dive straight in really with I'm going to send you off into breakout groups, which hopefully, again, if you've been taking part in the various sessions, you'll be used to this. But for your breakout groups, I'm going to give you one successful and one unsuccessful campaign. And really, in your breakout groups, I'd love you to sort of dig into them, have a quick read, reflect on your sort of initial takeaways, I suppose, as to, you know, what was good, what was bad about these things, and then potentially you've got an opportunity to sort of compare and contrast a little. And so when we come back, and this is going to be quite a long session, I'm going to give you, let me just double check the time. I'm going to give you, I think, sort of 20 minutes actually to really sort of dig into these. And when you come back, it'd be great to know, you know, what you think the sort of key success factors are, having looked at these campaigns. So I'm just going to stop sharing the screen a moment. Hopefully this will work smoothly for us. I'm going to now just upload into the chat box a couple of PDFs. Let me see. so hopefully you found that an interesting exercise and everyone was able to get hold of the files okay, etc, etc. So it'd be great to hear some feedback in terms of what you took away as sort of key success factors from that exercise. So again, because we're a relatively big group, if you want to type some feedback in the box, and then I'll sort of summarize it back so everybody can hear what you're up to. I mean, I might sort of start us off with an initial reflection while you're sort of thinking and typing, but for me, the language of the two is very different. So one feels like it's quite sort of almost like institutional, and perhaps even sort of just lifted from a grant application, you know, lots of internal jargon and that sort of thing. Whereas the other is much more sort of public facing friendly, I think, in terms of the way they phrase the language. So one takeaway, yeah, a more informal but informative approach is important. I think that's a really nice way of phrasing it, because absolutely, you know, it was much more, I think we're probably talking about the RVS one, aren't we? But yes, much more informal, but still, you know, conveying a lot of information about the project, you know, exactly what they'd need to do, giving lots of examples. So I think that's a really good point to sort of really sort of add to what I was saying. I think just because, you know, as you say, they sort of change the language and make it more public friendly doesn't mean you don't inform. Didn't feel there's much in common. No, not really. Yeah, two completely different approaches, I would say. Well presented and interesting with good rewards. Yes. Yeah, there's lots of lovely info to get your teeth into, isn't there, Andy? I think with WRVS, and actually the rewards is a nice thing to add on as well. And I think they've kind of again thought through how they can sort of we mentioned it yesterday, didn't we? How you can sort of leverage your internal assets to create these rewards. So just a nice little set of postcards, for example, is something that's, I imagine, relatively cheap and cheerful to produce, but links really nicely to the project. Unsuccessful one, limited audience appeal and a large sum to find locally. Yes, again, for me that was a big standout. I completely agree with you in terms of particularly just the size of that number. You know, in a campaign where you're thinking about, you know, people giving sort of, you know, 5, 10, 15, 20, okay, maybe a couple of people might give up into the low hundreds. You know, talking in the range of millions of pounds, I think is just, you know, people can't really see what impact their gift of 10, 20 pounds is going to have on that huge total. Absolutely. And like you say, perhaps if there's a limited number of people as well that are going to give to that, it's, you know, it's a bit of a they've sort of set themselves up with a problem right from the beginning there, really, I think. Anne-Marie says not very human in scale. Absolutely, yes. you made my point much more neatly than I just waffled on when I was reading Andy's, actually, Anne-Marie. So lovely. WRVS used their material. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's again a nice example of, you know, taking what you've got already and really sort of leveraging that. And yeah, just, you know, the fact that they picked such great emotional stories from their archive to illustrate, you know, the main body as well. I thought that little story about you know, the little old lady who was bombed out but still smiling was just, you know, it's beautiful. They've really kind of brought in the emotion, I suppose. And similarly, I suppose right at the beginning when they're talking about these sort of unsung heroes, and, you know, they didn't want their names up in lights. And again, I think that is quite a sort of an emotional hook to bring people in on, isn't it? Celebrity endorsement, yeah, absolutely. Again, we talked yesterday, if just in case anyone wasn't here, about influencers as well. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be a, you know, hugely well-known celebrity. It might be somebody, you know, in your very specific field who's well known to your very particular audience. But absolutely, you know, if you've got a well-known celebrity, marvelous. Christopher says no guidance in the unsuccessful one about how much to give. Yeah, I mean, that's a good rule of fundraising generally, that it really helps to give people sort of price points, and, you know, and it helps then people to understand the difference their very particular gift is going to make. So yeah, you've got no sense of absolutely links to that point about, if I'm just going to give £10, what difference will it make? Yeah, no advice or guidance. Or Lucy says WRS were lucky in having good visuals, yeah, and a well-defined national audience, but they made the most of it. Yes, absolutely, because I think, you know, okay, the library probably doesn't have, I think you're right there, they don't have as much to draw on as WRVS do, absolutely, but at the same time, you know, you could probably take that example and sort of you know, chop it down into sort of several smaller projects, and you know, use what they have. Oh, WRVS only say what they're using money for right at the end of the page. Interesting. I don't know if you think that's a good, bad, or indifferent, Amma, if you want to kind of add to that. Yes, Christopher. The unsuccessful one is all about the building. I think that links really nicely. That was Anne-Marie's comment, wasn't it, earlier, about being on a human scale? Yeah, you know, it's people don't give to buildings. People give to people is another old sort of truism in fundraising. If the platform's presented any limitations in terms of content, word count, etc. Absolutely, yes. I think it's a really good point. We talked yesterday about things like fees, didn't we? That kind of thing, particularly in the context of platforms. And I didn't actually have that as a point. I will add it if we run this course again. But actually, just looking at the you know, the capabilities of the platform is really important there. Yes, a film. Yeah, obviously, you know, you've got a PDF document, you can sort of dig into that, but again, the wisdom in this area is a film can really help to bring things to life. Julie says about the variety of stories in WRVS. Yeah, the dog hair one. Yeah, that made me itch. But yeah, you know, it's telling lots of stories, as you say, can, you know, appeal to slightly different audiences. They could individually be different stories that you then, you know, share via social media and your other channels. Ah, look at this. Yes, Richard's pointing you to my lovely poster. Yeah, engine room changing to achieve impact, which really links to that point about, you know, the human difference this is going to make. Timing, yes, Kat, you're preempting me on another example I'm going to share with you in a moment. But yeah, you know, okay, we can't all be lucky again in terms of timing, but I think if there are these connections that we can make, I think that's a really sort of strategic way to do that. Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you everybody for your really astute reflections on that. I think they were really helpful, and like I said, really sort of tap into, you know, a lot of what we know is sort of good good fundraising generally. Gillian's asking if we can send the docs again afterwards. I'm sure we can organise that for you, Gillian, no problem. Okay, so let me leap us back to the couple of slides. And I thought, just for, you know, a few people may have seen this case already, but I thought just for anybody who's sort of saying, well, you know, what about now again? What about the COVID situation? Is it, you know, is it possible to do something like this in the current climate? So, like I said, you may have seen this, it was shared quite recently, but I thought if you hadn't, it'd be a really nice example to share with you. So this is a really successful campaign, actually. So as you can see, it's at the time of me taking the picture, at least it raised 43,000. It actually set out to raise 34,000, so it's exceeded its target. So you know, definitely a good example for us to learn from. So this is Dr. Jenner's house, and as again I'm sure many people are aware, Dr. Jenner is the pioneer of vaccination in the UK, and used cowpox to create essentially a cure for smallpox, which is still apparently the only disease that has been completely eradicated through vaccination. So this is Dr. Jenner's house, which is where he actually carried out those initial trials. And it was very interesting to hear the situation that they're in. They were talking about, well, actually the vast majority of their income comes in through April and October, as it may be the situation for some of the people in the room. And they'd had a few rocky years leading up to this year, and really, I suppose, got themselves into a much better position financially. And 2020, bless them, was supposed to be a year that they were going to sort of fly, really. And so, you know, to be dropped into this terrible situation that we're all in was not great. So very quickly, actually, they had to pull together this crowdfunding campaign, essentially to raise enough money to get them through the, you know, lockdown, and to replace the majority of annual income they would have had for this year. And they had to just pull it together so quickly. So Owen Gower, who presented, talked about, you know, they were putting this campaign together at the same time as having to, you know, pack up the office and move everything into working from home. So you know, they knocked together a quick video that Owen filmed on his phone. But what's quite interesting is they said they launched the appeal and nothing happened, interestingly. So they generated in their first week £750, which is better than nothing, but, you know, nowhere near that target of the, you know, the 34 that they had to raise over 7 weeks or so. And I suppose what really leapt out to them, which is a topic, you know, we've mentioned several times, but I think, you know, is worth stressing again, was that, again, you know, you can't just put this thing on a platform and expect it to, you know, take on a life of its own. They had to actually work really hard to generate the sort of money that they've generated. So that first week, £750. What they said though was they actually had some messages which was really helpful to work with, and they used those, you know, those messages and those communications to help them adapt the case on the fly, really. And they said that core message of human ingenuity triumphing over disease, unsurprisingly, given the current times, really seemed to resonate with people. And so they were able to, you know, take that message, or take the feedback, and almost sort of build their campaign iteratively based on the sort of feedback that they had. So they did a lot of work essentially to engage with people, to promote the campaign. Owen in his session was talking about almost feeling that pressure to be on social media 24/7, sharing messages. Not every message being a fundraising message. You know, they knew people would sort of get bored if every single message was give us money now, but, you know, sharing interesting content. And they said, you know, as the campaign developed, their numbers of followers increased, and, you know, alongside that, so did the income that they were able to bring in. So ultimately, he talked about it being an amazing but exhausting experience, which, like I said, really highlights that point about, you know, you can't just put this stuff out there and let it go. It's, you know, it's about, like all good fundraising, you know, putting the work in and really sort of marketing it behind the scenes. So he gave, and I thought they were really good, sort of 3 top tips, which I think sort of link to some of the points that you've already made when you were, you know, giving your feedback from the other 2 campaigns. But they said, number 1, being clear about why. You know, why do you need this money? Which I thought, again, is really good. Maybe, again, that's another way of expressing what the issue was with our unsuccessful campaign. As you said, you know, it's about the building and not really the sort of the outcomes that sort of delivers for the human beings behind it. Second top tip, which won't surprise you at all, is commit to it and really sort of market it. He talked about you know, development as you go along, which I thought was really helpful. So, you know, you can actually add additional rewards to maybe capture more interest, or you know, reinvigorate the campaign, or perhaps even get people that have already given once to come back and give again. To engage with people generally, and again, the theme that we talked about in our last session, to connect with those influencers who could spread the message. And when I was sort of digging around in the bowels of the campaign and looking at some of the communications that they'd had, it was really interesting to see. I think there must have been one particular college course in the US who their tutor had shared this campaign with them, and so there were lots of people who'd given and then put you know, hashtag Brown 2019, because, you know, they were doing an undergraduate medical qualification. So you can see the power of having that sort of micro influencer, in that case, that, you know, that college tutor, I'm assuming, you know, spreading that message out to his students. And then the final point was really make it a conversation and be responsive. So and I think that learning about, actually, you know, look at the messages that people are giving back to you and use those to, you know, see what really floats people's boats and interests them, and then adapt that into your campaign as you're going forwards, was a really good takeaway. So yes, you know, you can do you can have a campaign, and a successful campaign in a time like today, I think, is the takeaway. But I suppose an additional takeaway that maybe Owen didn't mention, but I suppose if you're going to do it in the context of a big global emergency, one of the things I think they did really beautifully was actually explained how that was relevant as well to to them specifically. So I suppose you've got to fight for relevance at the moment as well. So there we go. So again, this will link with what we've already been talking about in your takeaways. I think probably a lot of these we've ticked off, but what should every successful campaign have? So you've got an audience. We talked about building the crowd, so I think that's a given. A video, which again you flagged for RVS. A website, and they say in the sense of the website being I suppose like the olden days shop window in a sense. It gives you that sort of sense of credibility. You know, this is a real organisation. They are definitely there. This is not a chancer that has just sort of popped something up in an attempt to, you know, elicit money from me. It sort of gives you that additional layer of credibility. Perks or rewards we've talked about, and we've talked about how WRVS did that particularly well. Pictures. So again, both campaigns used a few, but I think again WRVS did make good use of the visual imagery there as well. Testimonials can be good, which again might be a bit of a function of the software and letting you see other people's comments. But again, you can see that was quite a powerful thing for the Dr. Jenner's house and the examples that I was looking at. Giving people multiple ways to contact you. I think again that helps a bit with credibility. Again, you know, that you're not just a sort of fly-by-night organisation. You know, if someone wants to phone for a chat, they can. Tiers, which really again links to the reward levels. The right ask. So yes, I think the key thing really, and you identified it so beautifully in the unsuccessful example, was that sense of people being able to visualize what they personally could do and how their gift could make a difference. For the right length of time, especially given Owen's comments on how exhausting this was. You know, it's short, it's succinct, but you know, it's really sort of intensive in terms of your time and effort, and updating people as we go along. For the nerdy ones amongst us, the academic types like me, there is actually, I dug out a study, someone had done a master's thesis on actually what leads to success, as opposed to the more sort of anecdotal advice in the final slide. I think again it's fairly sort of self-evident. Radical innovations are less successful than incremental innovations, which is quite an interesting one. Maybe our unsuccessful one, which is about, you know, this whole new, you know, more than £1 million value building, could be seen as more of a radical innovation. Sustainability orientated projects are more likely to be successful than others. This again, number 3, is maybe seems a little sort of counterintuitive, but higher goals contribute to a lower likelihood of success. But again, I think for me it's that link between, well, what will my £10, £20 do? So I think, as you could see in the unsuccessful example, it was just really difficult for people to envisage where they would fit. So although that sounds like a counterintuitive thing to say, I think you can see in our unsuccessful example how that kind of plays out. There's not really an agreement as to long versus short duration, different in different contexts, I think, here, sadly, so I can't give you a really sort of key takeaway from that one. But the last one, and I think again we really saw this in RVS, the amount and the quality of the information is positively correlated with success. So, you know, lots of, you know, video content, images, and, you know, as we were saying when we talked about RVS, I think that is also the basis for, you know, materials that you can take into smaller bite-sized pieces and share out through your other channels as the campaign goes on. So I would guess there might be a link there to just the ability to market the whole campaign as well. Okay, so how does this all apply to you? What do you need really in your particular case for supporting? And I imagine you could sort of see this reflected in the again, particularly in the successful example we looked at. You need the need. You know, what's the need that you're trying to fulfill? How is that going to be solved? What's the impact of that, as we talked about, really at a human level? Add in some budget and being really clear about, you know, the added value to the donor. And I think it's quite helpful to take those points and almost switch it, or switch your mindset to the donor decision-making process. So, you know, from the donor's perspective, they're saying, well, what problem are you working to solve? How can you solve it? How can I help? You know, why should I trust you to do it rather than, you know, another organisation? Well, will you keep me informed, and what difference will I make? So you can see how those sort of translate, I suppose, from these points here into that donor decision-making process. So I'm going to give you a chance to have a practice. I said you weren't going to get a lot of me, and it was going to be more of you sort of talking to each other today. I've shortened this right down because again we've got a relatively short period of time. So I thought perhaps you could have a go at just bringing together the need, the solution, and the impact. And I'm going to send you off into breakout groups again, and perhaps if you pick one of the archives in the group, and if anyone has got something, I know from the conversations we've been having, some people are here just to sort of learn more about a hypothetical future campaign. You know, if anyone in your group has got something that's about to go live, it might be good to use their example. But pick somebody in the group and just sort of run through the need, the solution, and the impact for your particular potential campaign. So I'll stop sharing. Wonderful. Right. I won't take us back to slides because this sort of brings us pretty much to the end of the slot. But just to finish up, it'd be great to again, you know, if anyone's happy to share. I realised that it was you know, a very sort of quick and dirty attempt at something that, you know, probably would take a good sort of couple of days in real life. So if anyone would be happy to sort of give us a little bit of feedback in the chat box, or if you want to turn on your mic and just say it out loud, that would be marvelous. But hopefully, like I said, it's really just to give you a little bit of a taster of the tool that you can take away and play with a little bit more. Everyone's very shy. Oh, here we are. Judy says, wasn't quite sure what you meant by impact. So I think that can be you can use it in almost in two ways sometimes, I think, Judy. So sometimes it could be the impact of the, you know, what's the project, what's the difference the project is going to make. But I think it's really important to think about the impact for the donor as well. So, you know, what difference am I as a donor actually going to make to this? You know, why should I give you some of my hard-earned money? You know, what sort of impact am I going to have on the world? And Andy's feedback, I think the project has to appear achievable. Yes, I think that's sort of so crucial, really. You know, quite often the ones that seem to be successful are those slightly smaller, as we mentioned yesterday, you know, slightly quirky sometimes projects, rather than necessarily these you know, great big huge scale projects. Again, I suppose thinking about your audience in that sense, because again, if you're lucky enough to have a big you know, a big well engaged audience, then you might be able to do the equivalent of as we talked about yesterday, you know, building the base of the Statue of Liberty. Oh look, Lucy, your psychic powers jumping in here. Large impersonal projects, so breaking it down to sub-projects. Yeah, absolutely, I think so. Jennifer discussed funding for an extension and how that might be broken down. Again, I think really good point. You know, how do you take this big thing and break it down into smaller, achievable projects, mini projects? Anne-Marie is looking at raising the profile of Battersea cats and dogs over time. I bet you've got some brilliant imagery and that kind of thing, and yeah, strong characters in the history of the charity, which is brilliant. Wonderful. So that pretty much brings us to time. So I'm again very happy to hang around for a little bit now at the end and chat away if that's useful. But again, thank you very much for coming along. And the next and final session really focuses on the you know, how do you sort of make the most of the campaign once you've got it.